on Sunday, September 1st, 1996 at LA Con 2 with Mr. Ackerman. And let me bring the tape a little closer so that we won't have any trouble hearing. What's a good topic to start with?
Well, in 1957, 55 of us chartered a plane to fly over to London for the World Convention that year. And remember that Dave Kyle and Ruth had just been married. It was their honeymoon. Plane. There was some question as who should be the first fan to set foot upon British soil for the World Convention, and we finally all decided on Sam Moskowitz. So he went down what do you call it, the steps of the gate of the plane, and I followed shortly thereafter. Well, after the World Science Fiction Convention, we had a couple of weeks before the plane flew back to America, and we fans scattered out around Europe. I went first to France, and in Paris, on a newsstand, I noticed a motion picture magazine that ordinarily was about all sorts of films and personalities, but on the cover was Henry Hull as the Werewolf of London. And that attracted me, and inside I found that the entire issue was dedicated to Imagine movies. So I, of course, purchased a copy for my collection. I got back to New York before returning to Los Angeles, and at the time I had been, as a literary agent specializing in science fiction, I'd been selling to a magazine called After Hours, which was a kind of a poor man's Playboy, and it was edited and published by James Warren. Well, we'd had kind of a racy correspondence going between the two of us and getting a lot of laughs, and so he had volunteered to come meet me at my hotel. I answered the door, and what he wanted to do was to scandalize me. He had his girlfriend come, and she was supposed to rush past me, tear off her blouse, throw herself on the bed, and start yelling and screaming rape. And that was going to be my introduction to the editor-publisher of After Hours. Well, unfortunately, I instantly recognized her, and I said, oh, you're the girlfriend, aren't you, Mr. Warren? And he was hiding behind the scenes, and he popped out, and everything was ruined. Well, we went down the street to an eating place, and I remember I had a blueberry waffle, and he was asking me what had gone on, and I told him about the convention, and then I showed him this movie magazine from France. Well, in his mind's eye, he could immediately see it turning into English. He felt that all he had to do was write over, and somebody would lend him all of the stills. What he didn't know was that they were no person's property, but belonged to half a dozen collectors, and it would have been quite difficult to get them all back together again. Also, as he began translating the text, he found it rather dry and didactic, and didn't strike him that it would exactly appeal to an American audience. So he was going to give up on the notion. He had just enough money and credit at the time to do what is called a one-shot. That is, it could be about Marilyn Monroe or the Beatles or anything that's popular, and you don't expect it to graduate into a subscription publication. So he was going to do just the one-shot. I spoke up and I said, well, I have about 35,000 stills at the present time, and I've been seeing these fantastic movies ever since I was 5 and a half in 1922. So I'm sure I could put together a magazine like this for you. Well, he didn't know me from the proverbial Adam, whether I was just a Hollywoodan head full of hot air. And so he said, well, I'll come out to Hollywood and check you out. I didn't know till many, many years later that in order to make an impression on me, he took a bus to Las Vegas and then got on a plane, the big publisher getting out and meeting me at the airport. I was quite impressed in those days. He came out to my home and saw indeed I had 35,000 stills. So the next thing I knew, I was sitting at a dining room table with an old mechanical typewriter. And he was sitting opposite me with a sign which read, "I'm 11 and a half years old, and I am your reader. Forry Ackerman, make me laugh." Well, I hadn't had the slightest intention of being funny about anything. What I really planned to do was give about a 100-page magazine. There would be one definitive still of Dracula, and explain how the public reacted to it at the time, and my own feeling about the films, and a resume of the plot, and Frankenstein and things to come, and it'd be more or less like an encyclopedia. But Warren had gone around town in New York. At the time there were 13 distributors of magazines, and every last one of them turned down the idea of a magazine with a lot of crazy messed up faces on it. About that time, Life magazine came to our rescue, and they did a feature on the fact that there were now runaway successes in teenage monster magazines. I was a teenage Frankenstein, I was a teenage werewolf, I was a teenage tarantula, and so on. And so one of the distributors remembered this crazy editor who had been around and had tried to sell him on doing a magazine called Wonderama. He said, no, forget about that. Put monsters on the cover and you're in business. They didn't much care what was inside as long as it was appealing to the teenage crowd that was into monsters. Well, that didn't make me too happy. I really wanted a serious publication. I had no original intention of funning around with fantasy films, but that was what was required. So for about 20 hours, night and day, I was sitting with a smoking typewriter. I was afraid I was going to die of cancer. I was smoking so badly. And at 4 or 5 in the morning, publisher Warren and I would go over to a 24-hour reading place and have some orange juice and coffee and hot cakes, and then I would put him in a motel, and 4 hours later pick him up, 8 o'clock in the morning, and away we would go. Oh, we were so anxious, I just couldn't wait. I thought this was going to be the only time in my life that I will have edited a magazine. Didn't dream it would go 190 issues before it was the end with me. In February 1958, I believe, the first issue appeared. It was not circulated simultaneously all over the United States. They just had a tryout in New York and Philadelphia. And unfortunately in New York there's a terrible snowstorm going on, and Warren thought, oh, death, doom, and destruction, where nobody's going out to buy Playboy or Life, let alone our curiosity. But at the end of 4 days he called very excited. He said, "I've been getting 50 fan letters a day. We've got 200 fan letters just from Philadelphia and New York. Now, if it goes on like this all around the country, in Chicago and L.A. and Florida and so on," he said, don't you think we ought to squeeze out one more issue? Can you do it? And I said, well, Jim Warren, you don't know me very well. I don't happen to believe in reincarnation, but in case I'm surprised and I keep coming back for the next 5,000 years, yes, I think I can go on and on and on without ever even duplicating myself. First issue of 125,000 copies promptly sold out. Went back to press and did another 75,000. And I guess that's why to this day I encounter so many beautiful mint of the first edition of it. I believe I paid $300 to create the magazine, which meant I not only wrote about every word in it, but supplied all of the stills. And today, on at least 3 or 4 occasions, I've had fans bring me their first edition and ask me to sign it, and each time they've admitted they paid $1,300 for the magazine that I got paid $300 to create. Well, at the time of the third issue, I think, the publisher was always in charge of the covers. I had nothing to say about them, but I believe on the third cover he was going to just get a mask from a Halloween store well, some very common, ordinary, everyday sort of a scary mask. And I said, well, hey, wait a minute, how about the mask taken off by Mary Philbin of the Phantom of the Opera? You know, this is a movie magazine. Let's not just go to a store and buy a mask, but have one painted. And I had a science fiction friend, Charles Neutzel, N-U-E-T-Z-E-L, and his dad, as a matter of fact, drew that famous little squiggle of Hitchcock that we often see. And in the early days of films, Albert Neutzel, who preferred to spell his name N-U-E-T-Z-E-L-L, had done a lot of the artwork for movies when they had the title over artwork. And so young Charlie persuaded his dad to try his hand at artwork, and he gave us a wonderful representation of Bela Lugosi as the manimal, which was a term I created at the time to describe the evolved creatures of the Island of Lost Souls. And Albert Neutzel began drawing covers for famous monsters. And I decided early on that I always wanted Lon Chaney to be remembered, and Boris Karloff, and Bela Lugosi. So I would have a feature page called Lon Chaney Shall Not Die, and Bela Lugosi Lives Eternal. And when Boris Karloff passed away, it became Boris Karloff the Benign. In the end, I edited 190 issues of that magazine. It went up to, I think it was around 1971. The reason it came to wasn't exactly a screeching halt. For 4 years, I was getting more and more disappointed. First of all, I was never really paid any fabulous sum. There was a time on the way to my 50th birthday when I had a flock of heart attacks, and I found myself in a room with another gentleman who was quite familiar with New York and publishers and so on. And he said, you get $2,200 an issue, and you write the whole thing and edit it, and you provide the photographs? He said, why, do you know what the editor of Mad Magazine gets? $75,000 a year. And he doesn't have to write the whole thing and draw the pictures and all that, you know. He said, well, you know, what kind of an insurance plan do you have? And I said, none. Well, you know, do you get a bonus? No. And, you know, it's outlining all these perks that he seemed to think should be natural for an editor. And I said, no, none of that. Well, 4 years before I resigned, I realized that there was rampant inflation. And if I continued to get the same check every time I created a magazine, at the end of a year, it was buying me 12 or 15% less of mashed potatoes and steak. And so I discussed it seriously with the publisher, and he said, well, yeah, you're right. He said, once a year we'll bring you up to the standard of living. But year 1 went by, and year 2, and year 3, and at the end of year 4, I thought, well, I'm chopped down to about 1/3 of what I could buy 4 years ago. Also, the 200th issue was on the horizon, and I wrote the publisher, and I said, I know you won't pay an extra penny for this, but I would like to give the readers 200 pages, and you know, I'll do it for the same amount. Got no response to that. And next thing I knew, so I resigned at issue 190 was the last that I did.
What year was that? About?
Well,
what decade anyway?
check that out for you for sure.
Because
But
every month it started in 58, we can figure out. Okay. It would be somewhere in the 60s then, right?
Well, I seem to think of it as being 1971.
71? Okay.
I wouldn't swear to it.
Okay.
So he just kind of walked away from his life, became a man of mystery, and after the magazine went on one more issue after I resigned, and that was the end of it. And then people were constantly after me, what has become of James Warren? Well, I heard more fascinating stories. One, that he was unshaven and unkempt and muttering to himself on the streets of Manhattan. Another, that he was down at the waterfront clutching a pistol to his chest and declaring he was going to get the bastards who did him in. 3, that he was in politics in Connecticut. 4, that he was in an insane asylum in Connecticut. Maybe that politics and the insane asylum were the same story melded together. 5, that he was on some secret little island around New York, and he was driving a gold-plated taxi cab and picking up young ladies who were going long distances and would rather pay with their person than with their purse. And then the next thing, somebody got a postcard from him in Egypt, and then he was heard from in Greece, and this just went on and on. To this day, I really don't know why he walked away from his life. He walked away leaving, owing me $62,000, and I was just one of either 17 or 19 people with their hands out. It took me 10 years to get my money, but in the end they just paid 25 cents on the dollar. And also I had to give a big chunk of it, about a third, to the lawyer who got it for me, so I really didn't get too much out of that. Also, unfortunately, many of my stills never returned to me. Also, along the line, while Famous Monsters was going very well and I was very happy, he called me up one day and said he was going to create a comic book about, quote, a mod witch. What would you call her? Well, just off the tip of my tongue, I said, how about Miss Terry? And you say it fast, it's like mystery. Well, not bad, but no cigar, which I didn't mind because I don't smoke anyway. So I kind of forgot about that, and then I was flying down to Rio de Janeiro in a fabulous aeroplane. If that had crashed, it would have wiped out half of the fantasy community of the day. Directly behind me was George Pal, the director of The Time Machine and War of the Worlds and Destination Moon, and sitting with him was Yvette Mimieux, Mimieux, who was a Weena of Far Futurity, an H.G. Wells novel that was being put on the screen by Pal. Across from me was Roman Polanski, who gave us Pardon My Teeth in Your Neck, the Fearless Vampire Killers. And A.E. Van Vogt was aboard, and Robert Bloch of Psycho fame, and Poul Anderson.
This is 1969.
1969. If that plane had crashed, it would have been some tragedy. Well, it was around midnight and thunder and lightning, and I was wide awake, and I was looking down at the Amazon River, snaking along, and the hungry piranha were jumping up, hoping we would crash, and they would get a free hot meal for a change. And I began to think, you know, if we crash, we've got our fearless leader, Harlan Ellison. He can hack a way through the jungle and get us back to civilization. And we have the White Goddess. The natives have probably never seen anybody like this actress, and George Pal to direct and produce, and, you know, we'll have a fabulous movie. But and I thought, well, now, oh yeah, what about that Maud Witch? Well, Barbarella was very big at the moment, and I realized they'd be bringing back Cinderella, and probably would make a space siren called Estrella, and that eventually there'd be a XXX rated film called Beaverella, and Vampirella. jumped into my mind.
Vampirella, yeah.
Vampirella and her twin sister, Draculina, spelled with a K, and the planet Draculon. And all the things I've ever thought of, the 50 stories or so I've had published, I really feel kind of proud of creating a planet Draculon where the rivers flowed, they were blood. Not because any creatures were dying or anything, but, after all, blood is some kind of a chemical combination, and I suppose it'll be possible out of the millions of potential worlds in the universe that instead of H2O, that blood might flow around the planet. In that case, I figured, well, the people wouldn't eat anything. They would just drink their breakfast, lunch, and dinner in case they were 3 times a day like humans. And I thought about twin suns, and occasionally, like we have on Earth, we have when the moon, sun, when the sun is an eclipse. Yes, I thought, well, occasionally these 2 suns will get together. It'll be so hellishly hot down there that all of the rivers and ponds and everything will cake up, and the inhabitants will be in big trouble. So I halfway had evolved a story in my mind. Well, I got back eventually to New York, and the publisher had about half a dozen titles on a bulletin board, to which he added Vampirella. And as people came in, he said, if you were interested in comics and had half a buck to spend, which of those would you buy? And they all gravitated toward Vampirella, so that evening he tore it up. I wish he'd given it to me for my collection, now I think of it. And he said, okay, you just named her. Well, we walked out on the streets of New York, and Warren really didn't need any incentive to ogle every gorgeous girl. He had the big eye for them all anyway, but he was now looking for somebody who resembled Vampirella. He finally found her amongst my 100,000 stills at the time in a film called Danger, Diabolique, with a K. And there was an actress named Melissa Mell, M-E-L-L. I just recently found, unfortunately, the dear lady died of cancer some years ago, so she never lived to see herself on the screen in Vampirella, which on September 28th on Showtime will be finally on television in live form. An actress named Talisa, T-A-L-I-S-A. Lordy, what's her last? Talisa.
I'll find out soon enough when it shows.
Well, it's something like Soul, S-O-L-L, I think. Next day I sat down at the office of Famous Monsters, an old mechanical typewriter. I'd never done a comic in my life, but I looked at one. I thought, well, I guess you just say panel number 1 and explain what the artist should draw, and if there are any words in it, you tell somebody to write the words and the text. Well, I was halfway into it 1 hour when the publisher looked over my shoulder and he said, what are you doing there? I guess he expected to see Phantom of the Opera or Boris Karloff or something that would fit into Famous Monsters. And I said, well, I'm writing the origin story in Vampirella. Oh, quiet in the office. I didn't know we had a genius. You mean to say you write comics? I said, James Warren, I'm a grown man. If I couldn't write a comic, one hand tied behind my back and a blindfold over my eyes, I will jump out of this skyscraper window without a parachute. Well, we'll see. The end of hour number 2, I wrote the end. And he looked it over. Not bad, Oh, he caught me. There was one panel that didn't have an oof or a pow or a zowie. First law of comics, he says, you have to slow down the reader. You can't have him stand at the newsstand and just flip pages. Every panel has to have. So I think his great contribution was an oof or a zow or a pow. Well, the first issue of there was then the question of who was going to draw the cover. He had been over in France and had discovered an artist named Aslan, A-S-L-A-N. And for a while there was a companion to Playboy called Wee, O-U-I. And the pin-up nudies in that were drawn by this Aslan. So he said, well, he will create Vampirella. Well, as I understood it, when Frank Frazetta heard that, he broke down, cried like a baby with a busted balloon, and no, you have to let me create Vampirella. So Warren said, well, no can do, because, I've promised the original artwork to Ackerman, and you don't give your paintings away. Yes, he can have it. Well, a year or so ago, that first cover was auctioned, I think, for $72,000, and it had never been in my hands. I never got it. Trina Robbins, the kind of underground artist, dreamed up the threads that were thrown on Vampirella, and Frazetta did the painting that introduced her, and I think an artist named Tom Sutton, as I recall, drew the origin story, which some years later, when the empire of Warren collapsed, was all thrown away. Unfortunately, a friend of mine rescued it, Greg, G-R-E-G, Theakston, T-H-E-A-K-S-T-O-N, and gave it to me, the origin story, and also the second story. Well, I got paid $25 for the origin story. I never actually got paid anything, you might say, for creating the name Vampirella, but $25 for the origin story. And then the publisher wanted an inside front cover, so I dreamed up, I began calling her Vampy, Vampy's Fairy Tales, F-E-A-R-Y, Fairy Tales. And I got $10 for that. Then he wanted a name for the readers department, so I came up with the Scarlet Letters, $5 for that. Not $5 every issue, $5 once. Well, although $25 wasn't much for the origin story, it flew out of my fingers in 2 hours. And so I began writing other stories, 7 Footprints to Lucy Fur, F-U-H-R, like a feminine Lucifer, and Run for Your Wife. And I realized if I get up 2 hours early every morning and do one of these comic stories, well, 30 times 25, that's $750 extra a year, and it's no trouble to me. So I started doing that under various pen names. Well, about the time of the 3rd issue of Vampirella, I met up with James Warren in a hotel at a World Science Fiction Convention about 2 in the morning. And I was enthusing about the great success of the magazine, and I said, don't you think once a year we should take just the Vampy stories and put them together and re-release them? And I said, in effect, I'm just sort of writing little screenplays here. I could put some meat on the bones, and we could have a pocketbook. And what do you think about going to Mattel and, you could have 2 dolls for the price of one. You could have Vampirella with her black hair and just give them a little wig, blonde, and lo and behold, you've got her twin sister. And lastly, I said, I went to school with James Nicholson. We had a little science fiction club in the late 20s when I was in high school. And he is now president of American International Films, and he's very keen about science fiction. What do you think? How about approaching him to make a movie? We may get $25,000 and smile all the way to the bank. So he says, well, you all through talking? And I said, yes, I guess so. And he says, well, yes, of course we'll have a reprise edition, an annual, but and I've contacted Mattel. There'll probably be a doll. I don't know about you doing pocketbooks. Maybe I'll take you off the bench and see if you're up to it. But he said, there's one thing I don't understand. he said, you talk like you seem to think you own Vampirella. And I said, well, I don't know. She didn't come out of my mind and my fingers. You saw the whole 2 hours of the story. He said, oh, no. You've forgotten a very important point. And I said, what? You mean because you phoned and said 2 words, Maud Witch? Well, what can I say? The publisher takes all the risks, you know. You didn't walk into my office and say, Mr. Warren, I have a great idea for a comic. I said, well, you know, it's not a modern witch. It's a woman from another world who, because she comes from a planet of blood, happens to react like a vampire would. Well, you know, I said, in other words, you're telling me for $25, in case they make $1 million movie, I've had my share? Well, yeah, publisher takes all the risk. I said, well, look, the publisher of Argosy magazine took a big risk on Edgar Rice Burroughs, an unknown author, when he wrote Under the Moons of Mars in 1912 and followed up with Tarzan, but there's now a city named after Tarzan, and then, you know, Edgar Rice Burroughs is independently wealthy, and even the creators of Superman, it took a long time to get around to them, but toward the end of their lives, I think they've been shamed in them being given $25,000. I said to Warren, well, yes, you know, I really feel I am the creator. I would say that Trina Robbins had something to do with the costume, and certainly Frazetta for visualizing it, but you know, if you say for $25 for the origin story and 10 for Vampy's fairy tales and 5 for the Scarlet Letters, I've had my share in case a movie is made or something. I said, well, don't look now, but you just put a stake through Vampirella's heart. So I gave up on writing, doing anything further with it. And many years later, Jim Wynorski, Wynorski, he had been a fan of Vampirella, and he now became a movie maker, put me in a couple of his films and cameos, and he decided the time had come that he wanted to film Vampirella. Well, he had to get the blessing of a man named Harris, who had taken over when Warren went smash and owned the rights to Vampirella. So the only way Harris would release it to Wynorski to make a movie was just if in effect I would sign a lie and say that I was for hire, which I never was, not for Vampirella, not for Famous Monsters or anything else. I was always a free will agent, and particularly in Famous Monsters, if they ever repeated anything by me, I got paid like Bradbury or Van Vogt or anybody else for the second time around or third time around. But say Harris would not permit a movie to be made unless I signed a lie that I was for hire, so I couldn't get involved in any profits.
Was it about this time that you had your first cameo in the movies?
Oh, no. My first cameo
was much earlier.
Was 52 years ago.
Let's talk a little briefly about that. How you got to become in the movies for the first time.
All right. Well, in World War II, which I was involved in for 3 years, 4 months, and 29 days, by the time I believe I had become a corporal at Fort MacArthur in California, studio, I think it was Columbia, came and they were making a movie called Hey Rookie. And in one sequence they had extras getting out of a bus and arriving, and so they included me in a scene as the editor of the Fort MacArthur Bulletin. I was there, I think, checking over the newspapers. I did every week, proofreading it. And so they got a nice close-up of me in Hey, Rookie. Shortly after the war, my friend Walt Doherty, the photographer for years in Famous Monsters, he was involved as an extra in a film which got an Academy Award called The Farmer's Daughter with Loretta Young. and he asked me if I'd be interested in being in it. And as an ex-GI, I wasn't making much money. I was interested in anything to keep body and non-existent soul together. So I sat behind Loretta Young and one over to the left, and there's a scene in an auditorium where she gets up to say something, and I'm going, boo, boo, ladies, sit down, sit down. And oddly enough, a little postage-sized picture of me behind Loretta Young turned up in an issue of Life magazine at the time the movie was going on. So I followed up with something called The Winner's Circle. And
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. And
Hey.
and then I think about the next thing that happened, build up to finally 52 cameos by now. I guess I'm sort of aiming at 100, hopefully, in my lifetime. I have one coming up almost immediately, and before that picture is even through, they're planning on a sequel, and they plan to build up my part in that.
Which is the one you remember the best or had most fun at?
Well, some years ago, I got a call from Germany, and a chap was talking to me as an agent. He had read a story called the Möbius what? It was an astounding, the only Möbius story that ever had that at the beginning of it. Möbius, wasn't Möbius strip, but anyway, we can check that out. And he wanted to film it, and I think it was the only story the individual had ever had, and even they'd used an initial. I don't know, we didn't know whether it was a male or a female, but I thought I could track it down for him. And as we were talking, he got more and more interested in me as an individual. And he began to, I think he abandoned the idea of doing this story from Astounding and doing a documentary about me. Well, shortly thereafter, I was in Germany and France, and he made a point of coming to meet me, and he got all enthusiastic, and he was going to come over and do this documentary on me, an hour for television. But then it grew and grew in his mind, and he wrote a script in which I was the star. The story, just briefly, was about a man who ran a movie theater. And one night after he left, his daughter got interested in some reels of silent film, and she put one on. The first reel was missing, so she didn't know the name of it or who the actor was. But here was the star of that silent film. He looked kind of like Lon Chaney in London After Midnight. And suddenly the old celluloid film caught fire. And being a fantasy, where the actor jumped out of the film. And it was kind of amusing, since it was a silent film. Everything he said they would put on the screen in the wordage. And the problem was he didn't know who he was or what the name of the film was. And somebody said, well, the only man in the world who could answer that, his name is Forrest Ackerman. He lives over in Hollywood. So from Germany, they came over, and for about 3/4 of the film, I'm involved in it. And really had a sensible part. Another one that I was pleased with was called Aftermath, where I was the curator of the last museum on Earth after World War III had destroyed civilization. That was a really decent part. And when I became president of the United States and Amazon Women on the Moon, and followed up in the next film, Turkeys in Outer Space, I became president of the world. And then I was out of a job after 4 years, and all I could get was to be a judge in Nudist Colony of the Dead. It was quite a come down from president of the world. And in one film, I explode on screen. I hasten to point out that I am not the character in the title, because it is called Curse of the Queer Wolf. When the moon came out, he sprouted falsies and high heels and then falsetto voice. I've been in some pretty curious movies. If you put them all together, I suppose they'd last about an hour, and maybe somebody will do that someday. Well, did we get off the topic? How I came to be in so many movies.
Yeah.
The main reason I'm in so many movies, I've been in 6 by John Landis, because for years I brought Halloween to the kids of the country, every issue of Famous Monsters. And these kids grew up and turned out to be Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and John Landis and Joe Dante and John Carpenter and so on. So they all feel it's kind of amusing to have Uncle Forry in their films.
It's a good story. I remember once a movie I saw that was set in Pittsburgh where you were in a bookstore and you were doing something and the owner turned to you and gave you some nasty comment or
It
something.
was in Los Angeles. It was in Hollywood.
It was,
Yes,
okay.
it's called The Howling.
The Howling.
And many of my fans misunderstood that. I walk away in disgust from the manager, and I'm holding 2 copies of Famous Monsters behind me, and they all said, "Mr. Ackerman, why did you steal those magazines from the shop?" I didn't steal them. The whole idea was sort of identify me.
Was to identify you. Let's go back to some of the world cons. You have so many great stories about some of the more familiar personalities in world cons. We left off in the 50s when you'd had a story about Isaac Asimov, but there are many other people you've met, and I was wondering what your
Well,
impression-
I don't know, when I told about the Isaac Asimov, I walked away and had pushed my fingers into my cheeks because I was so sore from
Yeah,
laughing
that
at
was
him.
the one.
Well, I don't know. At the same convention, I believe, I was suddenly inspired. Robert Bloch was up on the podium. Excuse me, Bob, and I ran up and I just walked around him, and he looked kind of puzzled. And I said, well, my doctor said after every meal I should take a little walk around the block. and that eventually was what he called his autobiography, Once Around the Block.
Mm-hmm. He was an interesting personality all by himself.
He sure was. Yeah.
I remember every issue that we sent him, he would give us one of those little yellow postcards, and he had this ability to be witty and succinct at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you'll have to remind me what some of these other conventions were, or where they were.
Well, you've been to conventions in a lot of different unusual places. Tell us a little about some of those.
Well, one of the most unusual was in Heidelberg, the only time we had it in Germany. And I remember when I was just walking out on the streets of Heidelberg, and about 2 blocks away, I saw a fascinating young lady coming. She turned out to be Christina, Kristina, Hayland, Hilland, from Sweden. And immediately was struck by her, and she by me, and she's been married for many years and has a young son, and finally she and the son came over for the World Convention in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and then came and were house guests for about a week, and we've kept up a correspondence. Heidelberg, I recall, principally because they were so dead serious. They didn't want anything funny, or I don't think they wanted a masquerade. It was all kind of highly political that year.
1970.
Uh-huh.
Was it the setting very picturesque?
Yes, the setting was picturesque, all right. We took a nice boat ride down, what is it, the Danube, perhaps?
Or the Rhine, or wherever.
Right, whatever. First time in Australia, I guess it's been Australia 2 or 3 times by now. I don't remember what was the first or the...
There were World Cons in 75 and 85 there. But there's been other conventions besides that, of course.
75. I guess I was, must have been editing Terry Roden at the time in 75, doing 3 a month, and I was sitting up with bloodshot eyeballs, not only editing 3 Perrys, but as usual, more or less writing and editing Famous Monsters magazine. Or now we got a confusion, because I said Famous Monsters came to end with me in 71, didn't I? So I wouldn't have been working on it in 75, and yet, well,
we'll check it.
I was certainly working on Famous Monsters at some time when I went down to Australia.
It might not have been for the World Con. It might have been for a different
No,
convention.
it was the only reason I ever went was for World Cons. And I remember just prior to going to the World Con that I had been asked by the University of California to come out and give a 10-week extemporaneous course on science fiction. And I would dearly have loved to have done it, but I realized it'd take me an hour to drive, an hour to lecture, an hour to come back, and I didn't see where I could eke out 3 more hours a week, so I gave up, and they then chose the last individual on earth I would ever recommend it to replace me, namely Harlan Ellison, who in the first place claims he doesn't write science fiction, so I don't know why he should be lecturing about it. But I had to go out just once to see how he was handling it versus what I would have done. And already he was infuriated because it was being held in Ackerman Hall. Ackerman, I think, was some big football coach or something. So I still clearly remember the first words out of his mouth to his captive audience. He says, "Now you must never, ever, under any circumstances, use the abominable, the nauseous sigh, phooey, fie. What is it? It's ugly. It's the sound of 2 crickets screwing." My God, is that what I let loose upon the world? You must really have your ear down in the dirt to hear 2 crickets screwing. So I got down to Australia, and there was a little squib about me in the paper. According to the sci-fi pundit Forrest Ackerman here for the World Convention, his term has been defined by Harlan Ellison as a sound made by 2 crickets while mating. And the next day I saw a little kid, he'd made his own button, "I love copulating crickets." Well, at one of these world conventions, it seemed to me it was probably that one, I flew over to Tasmania and met up with Donald Tuck, who was kind of a one-man show. He did a remarkable book from A to Z eventually on telling us all about science fiction authors and editors and artists and their principal works and so on. And I didn't get to go to his home and see his collection because there was some big bridge that would have taken me there, and it was out of commission for some reason. Eventually I saw to it that Donald Tuck got a big Heart Award, and also let's see, Graham
Stone.
I always remember his name because
Graham Stone, probably.
Graham Stone, I guess it was, yes. Something comes by, it isn't quite. I always put together his name with like a telegram, so I remember Graham. I guess Stone, I don't know. Well, was he the independently wealthy individual? He split his fortune 5 ways with 5 children and still had scads of money left over.
The Big Heart Award is a story on itself, though. You decided that it would be a good idea to give the Big Heart Award.
E. Everett Evans was a combination fan and professional, elderly gentleman, never made a great deal of money out of his life, but he was always kind of behind the scenes. If he saw some young kid who, gee, would sure like to go to the banquet, but he couldn't afford the $10, why, $10 would mysteriously appear in an envelope under the kid's door, and he just gloried once a year at the World Convention in inviting about 10 or 15 pros to have a dinner with him. And
Please.
and so he died of a heart attack, and Walt Doherty and I thought, well, let's not let Everett Evans be forgotten. He was so generous in his day. Let's do something to make sure that fans remember him. So we created the Big Heart Award in his honor, and I believe the very first one went to Doc Smith, and then Robert Bloch, and Dr. Keller, who just gave away millions of words free. You could always get a story from him gratuitously for a fanzine. So we figured he was worthy of a Big Heart. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see it, but his widow was very pleased. Frankly, for, I don't know, the first 5 or 10, I just sort of played God and decided, well, I think Everett would have approved of this person or that. But by the time we got about 10, and I began to let the 10 previous winners vote. and more or less do that to this day. Sometimes I get caught short and just don't have time now to contact 25 people, and I found most of them don't seem to vote anyway.
The purpose of the award, though, is to honor someone who is unsung, who deserves...
someone that I think Everett Evans would say, yes, that person is unsung, and he's been doing all kind of good deeds, and that's the purpose of it. Well, I can tell you now, because in a couple of hours it'll become public knowledge, and this is going to appear
much later,
long afterwards anyway. There's a local chap named Dick, D-I-K, Daniels, and he for years has very quietly been going around photographing thousands of snapshots of fans and pros alike, and then the next time you see him, why, he hands you a fistful of photos of yourself. I'm sure it's rather costly, and he never charges anything or expects anything in return. Tonight I had hoped that Walt Doherty, who has a reputation of being the photographer of the M-O-N-stars, Monstars, he won't be here, and I hope to get J.K. Klein, who is also quite famous. He's a former winner of the Big Heart Award because he's been so generous in giving out photographs, so it'll be just ideal if the two of us can be up on the stage, I'll say, and playing the role of Walter J. Doherty tonight is J.K. Klein. And I have a little script where I'll say a few words and then he'll say some, and it'll go back and forth. And finally, one photographer will give the Big Heart Award to another one.
It's a good one. This has been going on for...
over 25 years. I've never exactly made a list of it. Some have died in the meantime, like Rick Snary got it one time, and Lou Tabaco, I believe, and Walt Liebscher.
Yeah.
And the women have got it, like Margie Ellers and B. Joe Trimble.
You've been a member of Blasphemous almost since it formed, haven't you?
I was at the very first meeting. I've been to 1,500 meetings, and at the 3,000th meeting, I was kind of a guest of honor and turned back the clock, time traveling and telling how it all began and highlights through the years and lowlights.
Yeah. In 52, you'd met Willis before he came over in 52, but in 52 you were able to actually take him cross country. Was that a memorable trip? From Chicago to...
I didn't take Willis across country. In 53, I took H.J. Campbell, who was the British editor of a magazine called Authentic Science Fiction.
I remember that was from cross country from L.A. to Philadelphia.
And I took Tetsu Yano, who was our first Sherman. You say in 52?
52, Walt Willis from Chicago. You brought him all the way out to Los Angeles, didn't you?
I did. Well, I guess so, because now something's coming back to me. Naturally, he wanted to... before I get to that, something else. In 1951, when I was all around in Germany and France and Scotland and went over and met the big three, including Walt Willis, out of that entire time, the only time I stayed overnight with Walt Willis, and I was deathly ill. I was ready to die. I felt so terrible. And when Walt Willis came to America, he returned the compliment. The only time he was ill was when he was in my home.
Oh, golly.
But Walt, of course, wanted to see Disneyland. 6 months after he had been to Disneyland, somebody... a fan came from Chicago and took the submarine ride at Disneyland, and he felt something rolling around by his feet, and just curiously picked up a little can of film negative. He took it back to Chicago with him and had no idea what it was about, and he has it prints made, and he was a fan of Famous Monsters magazine. And looking at these prints, he recognizes me. For 6 months, this thing had been rolling around, and anybody else on Earth who had picked it up, they wouldn't have known anything. So photographs of myself and Walt Willis and probably B. John, different ones were saved.
Got a little bit of time left. Tell us more about who you think are some of the more memorable characters you run into.
Memorable characters. Well,
not only necessarily fans, but even I know you met Bela Lugosi once.
Oh, well, for the last 3 years of Lugosi's life, I was quite close to him. A young man had never seen a Lugosi film till he was about 15. He saw one. He was so impressed with Bela, he went home and stood in front of the mirror and putting the whammy on himself and trying to talk like him. So then he found that Lugosi was living in his neighborhood. Well, he was afraid to go and ring Dracula's doorbell, but he got his aunt to call up and kind of fake it, claimed to be a journalist. Could she come interview him? And once he said yes, she said, could I bring my nephew? And he agreed to that. Oh boy, very proudly now called me up. I've become a friend of Mr. Lugosi. Would you like to meet him? Well, I certainly would. So he took me to his apartment one night, and I had the sound disc from the early days of talking pictures. I had them for Bela Lugosi in Murders in the Rue Morgue. And I played parts for him. He was rather deaf and cupped his ear, and he smiled, and he went out to the kitchen. He came back in a few minutes wearing a Dracula cape, and he put the whammy on me and my wife and Tetsuya, so I can date that. It was 1953.
Mm-hmm. What a guy. How about some pro authors you met? You've already told us about Bloch and...
Did I tell about Dr. Keller?
No, let's hear.
David H. Keller was a pioneer science fiction author who took pride in... He claimed that he had more babies per square paragraph in his science fiction than any other author. He did a story called Unto Us a Child is Born, and he had a story called The Lost Language, because when he was born, he had a little sister several years older, and for some reason or other, Mother lavished all her love on the little daughter and didn't pay any attention to little David. And he got the message, hell with that big person, I'm not going to pay any attention to anything she says. So he just closed his ears to English. He created a language all his own, and he taught it to his little sister. If anybody wanted to communicate with David, they had to go through channels. So he was sent back from kindergarten when he was about 5 years old because they thought he was the village idiot. He didn't pay any attention to anything big people said. Don't know how long this could have gone on, but when his little sister was 8 years old, she died. Yeah. And this left little David Keller incommunicado with the rest of the world. I always felt in reading his stories that they sort of impressed me like they were translated, but not from French or German or Russian, but, well, they were translated in a way from the lost language that he had in his mind. As an adult, he became the superintendent of the insane asylum in Philadelphia. And there was one lady who could have functioned out in the real world, but every once in a while, like Whistler's mother, she would go off her rocker, and so she felt maybe she should live her life in the asylum where they could take care of her. Dr. Keller realized early on when she was going to have a spell, because he said in actuality very few women found him particularly attractive, but when she was crazy about him. So one night as he was leaving the asylum, he said, you better keep an eye on her. She's going to have a spell, because she'd begun to be very flirty with him. Midnight, he got a call, help, save our life, and he went down, and here was a semicircle of the staff, and she was up on the roof in a flowing nightgown, and during the day they'd been repairing the roof, and there were a lot of loose bricks up there. So she was picking up bricks one at a time and hurling them at people down below, and he realized anybody went up, tried to talk her down, would risk getting his head knocked off. And he went up and he opened his arms and said, ordinarily he never lied to insane people because they could always see right through you. But his ploy was he opened his arms and said, come to me, my darling. And she dropped the brick, and like an express train, she came running and jumped on him and knocked the two of them were kind of rolling down the roof, and they came out and lassoed them and brought them into safety.
He was quite an individual.
He sure was. He told me that, and this was, of course, sounds ridiculous now, but money meant a little something. He said he paid people 50 cents an hour to listen to him brag about himself.
You got a little bit of time left yet. there must have been some of the happiest moments in your life were science fiction, of course. But which of the things that, if you had to live them over again, you'd go back to these moments?
Well, my 50th birthday, a few weeks or month or so before, I had a whole stack of flock of heart attacks, and it was questionable whether they had planned a big surprise birthday for me. They were going to lead me down the ferry path for some fake reason to come to a hotel. I was going to be interviewed together with Fritz Lang or something, and then I would walk through a door and surprise, there'd be a couple hundred friends. Well, they didn't know, since I'd had these heart attacks and was just recovering. Frankly, I only had about 2 hours energy a day for a whole year afterwards. And so they had to check it out, whether it was advisable for me to get this big surprise. So they kind of leaked it to me, and I sort of faked it when I walked in that I was thrilled. Well, I really was thrilled. That 50th birthday was one of the greatest of my life, and my 65th and 70th birthday, I think I had something like 375 friends from all around the world, and I got a phone call at 9 in the evening from Luxembourg, from Alex Kiel, Kill. It was really wonderful, to look at 375 faces and realize every one of these is smiling at you. There's nobody out there that hates you.
That's interesting. I guess that's about it. We're running out of time here. There's so many other things we could talk about. You were a guest of honor at Worldcon 64, but that probably wasn't exactly a too memorable time because of all the controversy that surrounded that Worldcon. And your guest of honorship tend to get lost in the shuffle. I thought that was a bit unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. I do recall there was a gorgeous gal who was a model and was a friend of Bill Rotsler, and she gave me the thrill of the way she came up, I think half naked, and gave me a big hug and a kiss.
Okay, I guess that's it. This will give me enough information.